Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see so many of you here today. I'm going to do a brief introduction. I suppose I'll talk a bit about my experience as an employment lawyer of mediation, particularly in the context of neurodiversity. And then Snoof will give more expertise on neurodiversity itself as a standalone topic. But maybe if I start very briefly with just a recent case. I act for a proprietary trader that is just based 5 minutes down the road. And they trade the currency markets, the future currency markets. They use the wealth of a single individual who was a very, very successful trader for 20 years. And that is the fund that they use to trade. Their most successful employee is a mathematician and programmer. And he was responsible for devising a program which was a form of machine learning, so a form of AI that would trade in an automated way the futures markets, and it's extremely successful. He is extremely systematic in his work, rigid in the way that he approached his work, highly introverted, found it very difficult to accept changes, particularly when he felt those changes were being imposed upon him, and displayed some traits that felt like they weren't collegiate, that they were destructive to the sort of common purpose of the organization. The organization tried to put in place grievance processes and performance management processes to try and bring him in line with their expectations. And the thing degenerated rapidly, and litigation started. His annual bonus entitlement was a maximum of about £15 million per year, and that reflected the value that he brought to the business. And so the loss of his cooperation to the business was vast, not just in terms of income generation, but just the distraction it caused from their core purpose and trying to reduce the temperature. I'll maybe park that story for a minute. They didn't mediate until well after litigation had started. And when we did mediate, it was extremely helpful. I find over the last 20 years, 20 to 25 years, that autistic spectrum disorder, ADD, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, etc., didn't pass my desk for the first 15 years of practice. Perhaps the odd dyslexia case. Now it's a weekly occurrence. There is a much higher instance of awareness. There is much more litigation. It is now a sort of typical part of the fabric of any employment lawyer's work. And actually, if you think about your own workplaces, I think we are all more attuned to the fact that there are actually very few people who you would describe as neurotypical. And there are lots of people in really important positions and in all sorts of positions who probably are neurodivergent in some sense. But the purpose of today was to extol the virtues of mediation generally, but in an employment context, it is incredibly valuable in terms of its general application, but it has real value if one of the parties has a neurodivergent condition. And the reason for that is because some of the traditional dispute resolution processes in employment relationships are really crude instruments. So if you think about a grievance process, what it requires is the individual who feels subjected to some mistreatment to write a letter that is essentially accusatory, that is essentially saying X has misjudged the situation, has mistreated me, has acted outside of our established policies, has done wrong. The subject of the grievance doesn't immediately embark upon a self-reflection. The natural reaction is to go on the defensive and to treat it as a dispute. It becomes combative almost immediately. It's a very entrenching process. And that is true of most of the other internal dispute resolution processes or other internal processes, performance improvement plans, where someone's behaviors or performance is suboptimal. That doesn't become a supportive collaboration. Often it will degenerate, and the person who is the subject of a performance concern starts to kick against the process, goes sick, or raises a grievance. And so all of these internal processes just become very, they become conflicts, essentially. I should have said I'm just going to do about 10 or 15 minutes, then I'm going to hand over to Snoof, who will do the same, and then we'll just have a discussion in the room. So I will wrap up what I wanted to say. For those of you who are employment lawyers, this will be more than familiar, but for those of you who aren't, it's just worth me touching on how this all works from a legal perspective. Most of the neurodiverse conditions that I've just mentioned are disabilities. The definition of a disability under the Equality Act is an impairment, whether physical or mental, that has a substantial adverse impact on someone's day-to-day activities. Substantial just means more than trivial. So if you've got a condition that has a more than trivial impact on your day-to-day activities, you're disabled under the Equality Act. Neurodivergent conditions are all lifelong conditions. They are neurodevelopmental conditions. So you live with them throughout your life. And lots of people can adapt and mask and overcome to a large extent, but they're still battling with something lifelong. And that's why the Equality Act is engaged. The Equality Act is an extremely powerful piece of legislation. And in particular, there is the duty to make reasonable adjustments. So that is either to adjust the fabric of the building, to provide auxiliary aids, or to adjust something called a PCP, a provision, criterion, or practice. So to change something about the way that you do things within your business so as to remove the disadvantage that the individual is facing. So in the case that I mentioned at the beginning about the algorithmic trader, the case that was brought was one of disability discrimination. And one of the allegations was that the internal processes that they had run were discriminatory because they failed to take account of his particular conditions. And one of the arguments was we should have used mediation, a non-conflict-based process, because that would have alleviated some of the disadvantages he faced. So as well as being probably a very helpful mechanism, it was also a mechanism that they said we were mandated to make under the Equality Act. So the duty to make reasonable adjustments is a duty that falls on the employer where somebody is disabled and they are basically struggling with some sort of established practice within the workplace. There is a second course of action called, it's where you treat someone unfavorably because of something arising because of a condition. So some of the traits you see arising, particularly from ASD and other similar conditions, is that there will be certain behaviors that the person exhibits that an employer may choose to treat as misconduct. So sometimes abruptness, rigidity, flaring up, if something happens, those will be classified very quickly as acts of misconduct, when in actual fact, they may be manifestations of an underlying neurodivergent condition. So maybe if I just pause there with that rough sketch of the legal framework, Snoof can speak to her slides, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end if there's any questions. Snoof, over to you if you can hear us.
Brilliant. Yep. Excellent. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Snoof. I'm here on behalf of the Brain Charity. I'm one of the senior training associates. So I provide neurodiversity in the workplace training, which you can see on the slide because I did not realize I should have changed the text when I made these slides. So I'm autistic, I have ADHD, and I also have dyscalculia, which much like you, Paul, I don't know how I'm supposed to pronounce it, but it's like dyslexia, both numbers and number concepts. I kind of like to contextualize what it's like to be the neurodivergent person in these situations. Obviously, I can't cover absolutely everything. That's just the way that it is. There are over 600 types of neurodivergent conditions, but I have got some kind of insights into how neurodivergence is relevant to the mediation process. Could I have the next slide, Paul? Would that be all right?
Yep.
Thank you. So why is this important? What I really enjoyed was when Paul was explaining that essentially disability is a social construct as well, right? So society has barriers in place that we can remove. Not everything can be changed, right? So, for example, I have chronic pain. There's nothing we can socially do to change that. But think of an example where I come to your building, I use a wheelchair, and there are only steps to get in. The problem there is not that I'm disabled. The problem is that the building is inaccessible. And if we approach accessibility that way, it actually becomes a lot more helpful, because if we approach disability that way, we can change something about it. We can actually say, hey, we can change the building. like you were saying, the fabric of the building. We can put in a ramp. We can use a different entrance and exit. We can actually think about these things kind of in a more inclusive way. And an important thing to bear in mind at all times when you're thinking about accommodations is that everyone gets accommodations of some sort. So the person who can walk up those steps that I mentioned is being accommodated by those steps. They'll be of a width and a depth and a height that they can manage. The door will be of a width and a height and a weight that they can manage. Your tables you're sitting at, the chairs that you're sitting on, this is all already built specifically to accommodate the majority. And when you think about accommodations as something that actually everyone already gets, and in this case, I don't get the accommodation because my need is to get in the building. My need isn't something special. It's just I need to also get in the building. Then you can actually see that accommodations are not unreasonable at all. And I think that's a really good way to reframe it, because very often people still think, oh, people are just being a little special and demanding, and they just want things that other people aren't getting. Some people still see it as some way of cheating the system by kind of having these accommodations, which obviously in that example is ludicrous, right? I'm not cheating by getting a ramp. But if you think about it that way, actually it becomes a lot more inclusive. It becomes a lot easier to see that actually what we're doing is changing something that has been excluding people, whether purposely or not. That doesn't matter. We're just changing it so that more people can actually use these services and use these buildings and use whatever we're talking about. Now, obviously, more and more people are being diagnosed neurodivergent. This is because we're actually addressing a lot of inequality. So we used to not diagnose people of color very much, women, working class people. And then also there has been a massive pushback from some people in terms of, I know that my child is neurodivergent, but if I get them diagnosed, then they might use it as an excuse, or they might then have a stigma that follows them around, which obviously means those people have been struggling knowing that they're different, assuming it means that they're doing something wrong, when actually it's just your brain developed differently. There's no value judgment there. There's no moral kind of failing attached to that. It's just that your brain works differently and you need to work differently with your brain. Now, when it comes to mediation, obviously, well, absolutely, that is a much less combative and adversarial kind of way to go about things than like a grievance procedure, or obviously going to court or going to ACAS. It is still a really stressful thing. So I'm going to talk through a few things to just consider in terms of neurodivergence. Could I have the next slide? Sorry, Paul. Thank you. So neurodivergent people might be in a very different environment to where you are. So you're sitting, for example, in a quiet room. Everything is fine. You've got nice, even lighting from the fluorescents. But if I'm sitting next to you, I'm sitting in a noisy room because I can hear fluorescent lights very notoriously make a buzzing sound. I can see them flickering. So I'm sitting almost in kind of like a horror film situation, like a room from Saw, and you're sitting in a very quiet, nice, pleasant place. It's just really worth remembering that these are not small concerns. This is something that someone might not be able to ignore. Specifically, when a baby is born, they have quite a lot of neural connections already in place. They get pruned back by about half as we grow. In autistic people, they get pruned back much, much less. So my brain has the capacity and the inclination to say, hey, look, hey, look, hey, look, this is happening. Hey, there's sensory input. Whereas someone who is not autistic, or who is maybe entirely neurotypical, might not be experiencing that at all. So they are able to just tune it out. And actually, I was an adult when I found out that's how it works, because my mother was very into putting wool jumpers on me. And I was like, oh, it's itchy. And she said, oh, in a few minutes, you won't notice that you're wearing it. Yes, I will, because my brain can't tune that out. My brain is going to spend all day going, this is itchy, this is scratchy, this is uncomfortable, this is horrible. I'm already in an emotional situation. Obviously, I'm already stressed out. I'm anxious. I don't know what the process is going to be. And I'm also having all this sensory stuff going on all the time. Lots of us mask a lot of the time, and lots of us just kind of pretend that we aren't noticing this, pretend that it isn't bothering us. But it piles up. Obviously, over time, it's going to keep on piling up and piling up and piling up and make things harder. So if someone says to you, I'm having an issue with this sound. My son gets taxis to school from the council, and he had an issue with like a smell that the taxi driver had sprayed in his car. It's not a small thing for us. It's not something that we can ignore. So just bearing in mind that this is something that's actually really all-encompassing for people, even though it might be something very small to you. I'm sorry, could I have the next slide, please, Paul? Sorry. Cheers. Now, social barriers. Obviously, some people might have an enormous amount of stress around social interaction, particularly with people they don't know, particularly with people that they feel might be angry with them, with people that they might feel are already disliking them for reasons they don't know. Some of that is innate. Some neurodivergent conditions just make us more socially anxious. Other things might be taught. A lot of us were taught, and especially this is very generational. Like for me, people older than me, people a good bit younger than me, you were taught that you were doing it wrong and no one was going to like you, basically. So you get into this situation and you already know ahead of time, actually, there's no way for me to do this right. I have never done this right in my life and I never will. For other people, I think for younger people, there's less of that. They're actually being taught much more inclusively, depending on what school they go to very much. But there is a little bit more of a push towards, you're not wrong, you're just different. But obviously there's massive numbers of people out there who are neurodivergent who have been taught that. Whether or not it's been tied to neurodivergence doesn't matter, because if you are neurodivergent, people will at some point decide you're different. We want to change that by essentially crushing you as best we can. So people will have been picking that up. So our anxiety levels might be higher because of that, might be higher as well because you don't know what's going to happen. Like the process might not be very clear to you. Extreme lack of self-belief in social situations, like people who think genuinely that everyone hates them when actually they're just perfectly normal people, or even that people might really like them. It might be more difficult communicating with strangers, like people might even have selective mutism. So where, for example, they might not be able to speak to a new person at all for an extended period of time. I know some I've supported in some situations where I have to speak on their behalf for about 45 minutes before they're able to speak themselves to this new person. These are all like massive barriers, and it's really hard to ask for them to be accommodated because we've all had that messaging that actually accommodations are cheating, asking for accommodations is being inconvenient, and that really like puts another barrier in front of you in terms of how do I actually get the mediation process to work for me when I don't even know how to explain and how to make people take me seriously in terms of these barriers that I'm facing. Could I have the next slide, please, Paul? Thank you. Now, communication barriers obviously provide written and verbal communication where you can be aware that PDFs are not compatible with screen readers. So if someone is dyslexic, uses a screen reader, or maybe struggles to pay attention, or maybe has visual impairments, right, then PDFs are not going to be helpful. Word document is going to be much better. Be aware of communication differences. When I'm saying communication differences, I also mean things like people being very blunt, people struggling to process what you're saying, processing it in time. It says here processing differences, so someone might get really hung up on a little detail where you're thinking that's not currently important, but that's the first thing they've spotted, because some people process from the bottom up, so they process the details first and then kind of move their way upwards. They might need a support person. Always good to kind of offer, do you need a support person? Do we need to invite someone else? I think generally in workplace disputes, that is the norm, but I'm not 100% sure. And then concrete language. This is a very funny one to me because when I was small, whenever an adult spoke to me, my big brother would take me aside and say, right, here's what they actually meant. We have this kind of way of talking, especially in a business context where we use a lot of idioms and buzzwords and kind of talk around things, right? Let's just talk. I'll just say things, and then I'm assuming from that that you know that I'm hinting that I want you to do X, Y, Z. I don't know that. I'm going to have to go fishing through your email for actual meaning. I'm going to go, okay, you said a lot of things. Which ones are relevant? Which ones are not? What do they mean? What hidden messages are there that you're assuming I'm going to pick up, but I might not? Some people are not aware of that at all, so they're just taking everything you say at face value. If you kind of run into the thing where it is considered rude not to write like that, just write like that, and then at the bottom of your email put in concrete terms, bang, 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 so that people can actually figure out exactly what it is that you need from them, exactly what it is that you're communicating. And it makes a massive difference, because if you don't know what people are saying to you, obviously, then that stress level rises, and the stress level rises, and it makes it feel more adversarial. You don't want to come across as someone who's asking for more clarification, who like maybe is stupid or wrong, or you shouldn't be speaking to at all. There's just a lot of things kind of wrapped up in that, and a lot of things are wrapped up in that don't necessarily need to be, right? A lot of that is things from, you know, when your parents were saying that you were going to do everything wrong, or when your teachers were really rude, or when classmates bullied you. But it's all going to be wrapped up in that, and you don't know how to unwrap it. If you don't know which bits to discard, all you know is you've been told do everything wrong, then it's really hard to then go, okay, well, I don't need to feel stupid. I'm going to just say, hey, listen, in concrete terms, what is it that you're trying to say to me here? You're going to instead kind of suffer and maybe do the wrong things or worry you've done the wrong things. And it just makes it all a lot more stressful, which obviously then makes people more defensive, makes it harder to actually reach any kind of agreements. Could I have the next slide, please, Paul? Thank you. People might not disclose their neurodivergence to you, okay, for lots of reasons. So people are undiagnosed, people are unaware they could be diagnosed. A lot of people who are not essentially young, white, middle-class boys still are being underdiagnosed. So a lot of people might not have any idea that they have got a condition. They will still know, in all likelihood, that something is different about them. And often neurodivergent people are taught to be ashamed of their neurotype. I'm 43. I started visiting a community space and met someone there who was also under the same autism support services as I was at the time. And he said, don't tell anyone. I don't want them to judge me because I'm autistic. And it's like, okay, it was 2018, I think, at the time. You're just thinking it's really, no one is going to judge you for that in this space and at this time. But obviously, that's not my place to say. But people are still very much under that kind of don't tell people, or they will find a reason to fire you. They will not want to be around you socially. You'll never have a partner. No one will ever basically want you in their lives. And even if people don't disclose or aren't able to disclose for whatever reason, accommodations are still just as important, obviously. And I have some recommendations to get around that a little bit. Paul, if we can have one more slide. Thank you. So I think, for me, if you want to lower the barriers for this, and I think that's really important that you do that, basically list your accommodations that you implement as standard. So, for example, we have a quiet room, we have a hearing loop, we have Braille documents available, whatever you've got for any kind of disability, just list that and send that to any initial communication with any new party. Doesn't have to be someone you suspect is disabled. Just anyone at all who's new to your company, just send them that. Add a section that explains what happens if they request accommodations, what happens if they request accommodations you don't have listed, so that they know what process is going to happen next. They don't have to just kind of jump into the dark and go, I hope no one hates me for this. I hope I don't get treated poorly because of this. And obviously, nobody here wants to do that. Nobody here wants to treat people worse for being neurodivergent, but it is something that many of us had extensive experience with, and it is something that does still happen. So it's not an unreasonable fear for them to have, and it's a good one to allay. It says here, mind the language used. You don't have to call them accommodations. You don't have to say to someone, I think that you're neurodivergent. Even if someone comes in and you look at them and you think, I think that this person, is neurodivergent. I have all these opinions. We all do it, right? We shouldn't, but we all do. Don't put that into there. Just go, here are things that we can do differently. Is there anything that we can do to make things more comfortable for you? Is there anything we can do to help allay your anxieties? So that they don't have that stigma of, oh, if I ask for accommodations, I'm saying, yes, I am neurodivergent. Yes, I am disabled. So they can just ask for what they need and hopefully actually engage with that. You're never going to catch everyone. There are going to be people who for the rest of their lives are hiding the fact that they're neurodivergent, hiding the fact that they need those accommodations. But this is the way, in my opinion, to lower the barriers as much as possible, make it as easy as possible for people to engage with that if it's something that they need, and actually, hopefully then have the best possible outcome from mediation. I think that's it for me, but Paul and I had some time set aside for questions.
Tim.
Hi. Would you prefer to have an in-person mediation or a remote mediation?
So would I prefer in-person or remote? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Personally, I would prefer remote, but it kind of depends on the individual. Obviously, I think most people that I know who are neurodivergent would prefer remote. But sometimes it can be easier in person for some people. It can be as well, like if you're dyslexic and someone is right there who can kind of help you get through the bits that you're struggling with, that can be very helpful in person as well. So it's always worth checking with the individual what they'd prefer.
And Tim, what we've tended to do when we're setting up a mediation for someone who is neurodivergent is to try and identify a mediator with experience of working in that area, and then to ensure that before the mediation starts, there's quite a rich dialogue with the individual. What are their preferences? How, being really clear about how the process will run, trying to identify the kind of trip hazards, the things that the individual will find particularly difficult. I think that sort of predictability, agreeing things up front, and configuring the mediation in a way that suits the individual is really important. Then you're setting it up for success. I think if particularly with ASD, if someone's going into a process and they don't fully understand the rules of the road, you're undermining the effectiveness of the process.
Absolutely.
Stuart Lawrence from Mediation Conference. Nice to meet you, Snoof, and thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
In the documents there, you said that there might be an occasion where someone who's neurodivergent might get hung up on a specific point that is not necessarily relevant or germane to resolution and mediation. Are there any techniques that you can recommend that we could potentially use to try and get over that, what we might see as an unnecessary hurdle, or something that's just stopping the progress? What would you do or recommend that we do to try and get over that hurdle?
Thank you for the question. I would make sure that you bear in mind processing time. So even though in this case we're talking about processing difference, I'd make sure that people have plenty of time away from the actual situation to actually think these things through, get there in their own way. So if you start with the details, it's going to take you longer to get up to the top because you're starting sometimes at the bottom instead of at the top, and it's a harder way up, right? Giving people plenty of time to get through things, giving people plenty of time to get their questions together, and then maybe making sure that someone sits with them and goes like, okay, look, these bits are this, explaining them quickly, and just, we don't need to ask those within the actual mediation bit. We don't need to worry about those because they are details that at this point don't matter, or the wording here is not important. So for me personally, I hang up very harshly on how things are worded sometimes, and I'll be like, oh, I'm really stressed out because it's worded in a way that implies X, Y, Z. Having someone kind of take it through with them before they're in front of everyone, having someone kind of explain which bits are important and why, but just giving it that more time, I think, is the main thing. Just giving people extra time to process the way that they process things naturally. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, Tim Casfield. Thank you very much again, Snoof, for what you've said. Is there an accreditation course for lawyers to either better interact with neurodivergent people, better to interact with neurodivergent owners, or an accreditation course for mediators that we could either go on or maybe set up?
Yeah, I mean, I did speak to your colleague, and potentially if there's an appetite, and I think based on what you've said, I think that hopefully will be to do something a little bit more bespoke, but I don't know if there's any sort of formal accreditation, because it would be useful. I think the point Paul made about mediators having training in neurodiversity to be able to speak to people when we're doing mediation, people from the ND with ND characteristics, to say we've got people who automatically have an understanding. It might make the person feel more at ease with the whole process.
Absolutely, yeah. So what I do is I provide neurodiversity in the workplace training. We don't have any accredited kind of things at the moment, but as Paul said, we're looking at maybe making something a little more formal. I don't know what that looks like in terms of accreditation, but it's something that we're definitely looking into, yeah. And it is something I would recommend, because very often I think the kind of when it gets adversarial between neurotypical and neurodivergent people, it's very often, I think, a misunderstanding of like, this is not, people aren't being rude to you on purpose, or people, aren't trying to get away with something. And it's kind of not, it's not actually anything where anyone is angry or trying to be mean to anyone, but just that people don't understand each other. So I think that actually is very helpful.
Was there a question at the front?
Yeah, I was wondering, I deal with contentious probate disputes, so I have lots of siblings against each other, and the number of times I'll see, I'm talking about older, usually older people. And I'll see, to me, quite clearly someone with neurodiverse characteristics, and then a very frustrated sibling on the other side that's been having to deal with him for 60 years. But in terms of a mediation, firstly, they're never diagnosed, these people, a lack of self-awareness, and I'm trying, either as their solicitor or in the different cases their mediator, trying to work with them to reach a solution. What would it be useful when you were talking about accommodations? Would it be and explaining things and putting in that groundwork? Would it be useful if we had a fact sheet rather than dealing with the intricacies of mediation, dealing with the real basics? You know, you're going to be in a small room. The lunch is going to be provided, all those kind of things. Would that be useful? And would that be something that someone like the Brain Charity could look over for us to see whether we got it right? Because I think that's a worry as well, that we're not getting it right.
Absolutely. No, that would be great. The more information you can provide, obviously, the better, although there gets a point where you're like, now it's overwhelming, but absolutely, yeah, definitely. I'm very happy to look over that for you anyway. But yeah, that's a very good plan. It is very often these things where people don't realize that that's stressful. Is lunch going to be provided? I don't know. Okay. But then there's all these other question marks next to it. So the question marks feel bigger than what they are, really. You know, on a normal day, you're like, yeah, is lunch provided? I don't know. I'll go to Greg's if not, you know, but if I'm going into this like really stressful situation, then actually it becomes a lot more stressful not to know this kind of detail about the day. That's definitely a really good plan. Yeah, absolutely. But send me an email anytime. I'll look over that for you if you like.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that I'm delighted that I have a son who is neurodivergent. He has dysppraxia and severe dyscalculia, and also high functioning autism. So he's brilliant. And the reason why I'm so grateful to him is because in my last mediation, which was last week, I had two ladies, two of them in a senior position, one of them in a higher senior position than the other. And one of them is a neurodivergent. She has bipolar and she has ADHD. And I think also her communication skills were not very good. And it was really, if I didn't have my son in my life, I don't think I would have understood her at all, because she kept on, and the other lady, which is also brilliant, but very logical, couldn't understand, not in a million years, what the Nigerian woman wanted from her. But if I didn't have my son, I wouldn't understand her at all. All of what she wanted from the other lady is for her to understand where the problem is, and the other lady, the logical one, will say, well, I promise you I will never do it again, and let's hug and cuddle. And she wouldn't have it. The lady with the neurodivergent, she insisted on it. And we spent a long time in the mediation whereby she insisted to explain what the problem is, because she said, if you're forgiving me and you're ready to move on without understanding what the problem is, you are a nasty, nasty person. This is how the mediation went on. And of course, I wouldn't take sides. You know, it's not my job to take sides. But I did my best to make this logical lady to understand how this detail is so important, because this is the core of the problem, really. That's why you don't get along, because you don't see what she sees, and she's trying to show you where she's coming from. We ended the mediation whereby they did hug each other, but we didn't. It hasn't ended, because the neurodivergent woman insisted that they will have a settlement agreement, which hopefully Stuart will help me with that, where there will be an agreement in writing between the two of them, where the logical person have to show that she understood where the problem is, so she wouldn't repeat it again. So I'm waiting for them, for the two of them. I insisted that they will discuss it between them. And then
Yeah.
they will write to me, telling me what they want to have in the settlement agreement between them, and I will ratify it if you like. It was quite an experience. So thank you, and thank you to my son that helped me to see.
No, thank you.
See, you know,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have seen what the problem is.
It can be very tricky. I think it's right, exactly as you say, though. If you don't understand what the problem was, you're just going to keep doing it again and again. But yeah, it is, sometimes the attitude is still very, no, I've said, you know, it's done now. I don't need to understand it. It's just over. Yeah. But thank you so much for telling me that. And thank you so much for telling me about your son. He sounds brilliant.
Yes, thank you.
Snoof, can I just end with one more, maybe a sort of cluster of questions? The
Yeah.
first is around, I suppose, language. Autistic spectrum disorder. Firstly, disorder feels pejorative. Spectrum feels sort of simplistic, like people exist on this binary sliding scale. And I know that there are wider issues around language.
Yeah.
For example, the term Asperger's, I think, has become controversial, even though it was commonly used. So anything you have to say on language would be interesting, because I think language is important, so you don't alienate people at the outset by offending them. I suppose
Absolutely.
the
Sorry, go on.
second question is just about any examples you've seen of this working really well in a conflict situation, and some of the considerations that have led to that success.
Sure. Okay, yeah. So in terms of language, so Asperger's, as you say, has become controversial. It's been removed as a diagnosis, actually, for a variety of reasons, actually. Obviously, Hans Asperger was working for the Nazis, but also kind of tying into the spectrum side of what you're saying. Autism has never been a spectrum in terms of a sliding scale from a little bit to a lot autistic. And that's how it's often been interpreted. And kind of Asperger's fit into that. That's just a little bit. And then a lot is if you don't get Asperger's, you get an autism spectrum condition or an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, then you have a lot. Actually, the way that the spectrum works is that every single autistic person experiences autism differently. And the traits that we have will differ. How those traits express themselves will differ. So every single autistic individual will have a completely different and new way of expressing the fact that they are autistic. And that's not anything that we choose, but it can be, as an example, you can have a lot of sensory issues, not very many sensory issues. You can have a lot of social issues. You can have lower kind of issues with that. So it's less about a sliding scale, although it's been interpreted that way for a long time by a lot of people. It's actually about the ways that you express the traits that you have, and the traits that you in fact have to express. Now, disorder is one that is being pushed back on, thankfully. It is now actually being diagnosed as autism spectrum condition. I'm a little bit on the side that we are medicalizing something that is part of natural kind of variety of humanity, right? But also there is then kind of the politics of what is and isn't considered a medical condition, therefore what you can and cannot have diagnosed by the NHS, what you can and cannot get sort of treatment for, obviously less so with autism, but ADHD, for example, that would be covered by the NHS. So dyslexia, for example, is not considered a medical condition. So in order to get diagnosed with dyslexia, you got to take a very different pathway than the one that than the one for getting diagnosed as something that is considered a medical condition. Obviously, people are deciding what isn't a medical condition, so it's all very complicated. The main thing I would always say is check with people how they want to be referred to. So, for example, there's been a massive push towards person-first language, right? Where you say person with a disability instead of disabled person, or person with autism instead of autistic person. Both of those are actually, by the general communities they describe, not preferred. So I prefer to be an autistic person. I prefer to be a disabled person, most autistic people and most disabled people prefer the identity first language. So disabled person, autistic person. But then there are groups where it's different. So people with Down syndrome tend to prefer person first. They tend to prefer to be referred to as a person with Down syndrome and not whatever alternatives that people come up with. And then within those groups, there are still people who have their own opinion and say, actually, I want to be referred to as a person with a disability. So I don't want you to refer to me as a disabled person at all. So my take is very much and extremely unhelpfully, I'm afraid, that you have to talk to the people in question and ask how they want to be referred to. And if you are, for whatever reason, having to refer to people by their disability, which in fairness is not super often, I don't think, then speak to them or try and find out what the community tends to prefer. And it's very tricky. I appreciate that. I talk to a lot of neurodivergent people, and I talk to a lot of like disabled people all the time in the course of my work. In the course of I'm a freelancer, so I also teach kids and adults about making and coding and things. So I speak to a lot more neurodivergent people than most. So you kind of develop a way of doing it, but it's very much individualized, and it's just one of those where you should absolutely ask people kind of what their specific preferences are. But I do also think that we worry a little too much. Like, how often do you have to say to people, this is XYZ and here's their neurotype? It doesn't necessarily come up as often as I think we all fear that it does. And I also feel like there are people that refer to me all sorts of ways. And I tend to find that if their intent is clear and their intent is to help or to not be harmful at the very least, like obviously I get introduced as a trainer all the time, and obviously my disabilities come into that and people say the wrong thing, but I don't take that as they are being malicious, because they are showing me in other ways that actually they want to be helpful. They want to be they want to know more about neurodivergence, they want to know more about disability, they want to be more accommodating. So I think maybe it's one where, on one hand, yes, we have to be careful about this as best we can. On another hand, I think we are also a little bit prone at this stage to thinking it's the end of the world if I get it wrong, and it isn't. It almost certainly isn't. I mean, it could be, but it's unlikely. But I think definitely speak to people, say like, how would you like me to refer to you if I have to refer to you in this context, and see what they say, because there isn't any community that has one homogenous view on what they would like to be called. I'm sorry that that's not very helpful. What was the second question?
It was about whether there were examples of employers that have dealt with this particularly well, particularly in the space of conflict resolution.
Absolutely. So I don't necessarily get to be a part of the conflict resolution very often, because I usually see people and then tell them about neurodivergence and kind of, help them kind of discuss it in a more constructive way. But the ones that have worked really well have always been ones that have embraced neurodivergence. Something that has always made a massive difference, and I'm aware that I'm not necessarily asking you to do something that's doable in the short term here. The companies where it works best are the companies where people feel and are at liberty to talk about the struggles that they face and talk about their neurotype. I had one, and there were 5 ADHD people and one with who was autistic, who were on the call, and they all just talked about what did and didn't work for them. And the way that they talked about it made it incredibly clear, not only in the accommodations they'd been given, but in the way that they very freely discussed it, made it very, very clear that actually they had no concerns whatsoever that their neurotype was going to be a problem at work. Another one that comes to mind is where actually the CEO has ADHD and is dyslexic, and it's just a difference in terms of people being embraced rather than tolerated. And I think that's a really tricky kind of thing to achieve at first, because you're going, how do I do that without being really weird, right? Hey, let's have an awkward hug. I don't know. But that's kind of where my advice is always to make sure that if you have a position that is going to involve speaking to neurodivergent people, if you can have neurodivergent people employed in that position or employed kind of adjacent to that position, is always a positive thing. It is not negative to hire people who actually understand what others are going through. I understand, I'm not saying hire people solely because they're neurodivergent, but I am saying that like there is a reason why actually hiring people with various life experiences and various kind of marginalized characteristics is a positive thing, and it's because the people who engage with you, who share those characteristics with them, are going to actually share experience with those people and are going to feel like they're understood and are going to be understood in a way that otherwise is not necessarily possible. So that's once again not a super helpful answer, actually. Can I ask you a question, Paul? Is that all right? That way we can pretend that I answered questions really helpfully.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
So sometimes you do get kind of situations where neurodivergent people might exhibit behaviors that are not compatible with the workplace. How would you recommend approaching that kind of situation?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of cases where behaviors exhibited are highly disruptive or undermine working relationships. And I suppose you have to sort of split it into two parts. One, is the behavior the consequence of an underlying condition? Is there a causative link? And two, if there is, there comes a point at which that's just not tolerable. The duty to make reasonable adjustments is only to go as far as what is reasonable, what's practicable, what works. And in the extreme cases where that behavior is unpleasant and causing distress more widely, then that is not something that an employer has to tolerate.
Adjustment needs to be reasonable, that's it.
That's it, exactly that. So yeah, that would be the simple answer to that question. I mean, I suppose the nuance would be if there's a complete lack of understanding, if somebody's circumstances and condition have not been understood, have they been put in a position where their flare-ups have become more extreme because they've been let down? So there is something about fostering an environment in which people have a better level of understanding and that support happens at an earlier stage. But that aside, there's a reasonable line to be drawn in most cases.
Of course. And to what degree is cost relevant in these situations, like in situations where accommodations have to be made?
Employers often are reluctant to put their hand in their pocket. Cost is a very poor defense for not making an adjustment. So you have to err on the side of being as creative, as facilitative, as generous as possible. If there is an adjustment.
I just keep my mind the name where you can apply for money for adjustments.
Access to work.
Yeah, access to work, yeah.
Yeah.
They are very helpful, but they have a 24-week waiting list at the moment, I believe, last time I checked. So that's always worrying. Where people have to wait for their accommodations for half a year is not necessarily sustainable.
An objection on cost grounds is often a poor basis not to implement an adjustment. But yeah, access to work is definitely worth thinking about this. Even though notwithstanding the delay, it can be a good avenue.
What is your small business? Less than 20.
No, that's a very good point. What is reasonable is specific to the circumstances. So if you Google what's reasonable is very different to if you're the 2-3 person business who's operating on a shoestring. It's relative to your resources. Stuart, I think we're over time.
Yeah, no, that's been excellent. I personally really enjoyed that. Thank you. And it's been some great information. Thank you ever so much. Really appreciate your time, and we're happy to let you go and do whatever you need to do for the rest of the day. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Snoof.
Thank you all. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for your time. Bye.